Hi, my friends.
Sayer didn't wait for dessert. He waited for the room to be full. Candles burning, plates still warm, Blythe's family clustered around our table like they'd been issued seating assignments by the universe. Then my son lifted his glass and said, clear as a verdict, "Mom, Dad, you're not a priority anymore. My wife's family comes first." Blythe didn't even blink. She just gave a small, satisfied nod, like a clerk stamping a document. I looked at my wife, Marin, and she looked back at me. One quiet glance that carried 60 years of decisions made without applause. I set my fork down slowly, not because I was stunned, but because I wanted the sound of porcelain to land like punctuation. "Good," I said, calm enough to make people uneasy. "We remember." Someone chuckled in that nervous way people do when they hope a joke will defuse a blade. I offered a thin smile, the kind you use when you've seen a man confuse comfort with control. Cormac, Blythe's father, leaned back in his chair as if he'd just won a silent auction on our dignity. Lenora, her mother, studied Marin's face like she expected tears to appear on command, the way they do in bad movies. I didn't give her the satisfaction. I gave her nothing at all. Subscribe, hit the like button, and tell me in the comments how old you are and where you're from. For you, it's just a small thing. But for me, it's the reason I keep telling these stories. Sayer's eyes narrowed, because he couldn't tell whether I'd surrendered or set a trap, and that uncertainty bothered him more than anger ever could. Marin dabbed her lips once, neat and unhurried, and I noticed Blythe watching her hands instead of her face. People always watch hands when they're afraid of what you might do next. I reached for my water, took one measured sip, and decided right there. If we weren't a priority, we would become a consequence. That night, after we left, my phone lit up with a message from Sayer. A family schedule for the next year. Written like an order, not an invitation. I stared at it a long moment, then forwarded it to Marin with 2 words. They started. The schedule arrived at 6:12 a.m., which told me more than the words ever could. Sayer had always believed authority worked best before coffee, when people were still soft. I read the message slowly, standing in the kitchen, while the kettle whistled itself into impatience behind me. It wasn't a schedule, it was a list of expectations, color-coded like a military exercise, with our names slotted neatly into empty spaces. Babysitting, holidays, emergency availability. Not once did the word ask appear. I smiled despite myself and reached to turn off the kettle, missed the switch, and had to try again. Proof that even a man with a plan can still fumble a morning. Marin watched this from the table, one eyebrow lifting just enough to be amused. "Careful," she said lightly. "They might schedule you for boiling water duty next." I sat down across from her and slid the phone between us, face up, like evidence. She didn't touch it right away. She never does when she wants the other person to feel the weight first. When she finally read it, her mouth tightened, not in hurt, but in calculation. I knew that look. It's the one she used years ago before walking into a negotiation that everyone else thought she'd lose. "They're not angry," she said after a pause. "They're comfortable." That was the first unfairness, quiet but sharp. Comfort built on the assumption that our time, our silence, and our resources were permanent fixtures. I thought about how Sayer used to ask permission to borrow my tools, and now felt entitled to our calendar. I typed a response, deleted it, then locked the phone and set it aside. Some messages are better answered with absence. We ate breakfast without rushing, the clock ticking louder than usual, and for the first time I noticed how often people confuse speed with power. By noon, the first follow-up came, a casual text from Blythe pretending the schedule was just a draft. I didn't reply, because drafts can be revised, but principles can't. The first real injustice arrived disguised as courtesy. Blythe called that afternoon, voice sweetened like she'd practiced in the mirror, and thanked us for being flexible, even though we hadn't agreed to anything. I listened without interrupting, holding the phone away from my ear while it slipped slightly in my hand. Old screen protector, smooth as ice, a small domestic betrayal of its own. She explained how her parents needed help with a weekend event, and how it just made sense for us to cover the kids. When she finally paused, waiting for my approval, I counted 3 slow breaths before answering. "We already have plans," I said, which was true, even if those plans were simply not being available. There was a beat of silence, sharp enough to cut paper. "Oh, she replied, surprised, not that we were busy, but that we dared to be. She recovered quickly and laughed, a brittle sound, saying she'd assumed we'd understand how things worked now. I almost told her I did understand perfectly, but I let that thought stay where it belonged. Instead, I wished her a good afternoon and ended the call before she could reframe the conversation. Marin looked up from the counter, where she'd been rearranging the same stack of mail for the third time, her version of pacing. That went well, she said dryly, and I nodded, because understatement is a form of mercy. I tried to open the wrong drawer for a spoon and caught myself, chuckling. Even habits protest when the ground shifts under them. The humor didn't soften the moment. It sharpened it, reminding me how easily routine turns into entitlement. An hour later, Sayer sent a message saying Blythe was upset and that we should talk it out like adults. I read it twice, noting how adulthood apparently meant compliance, not conversation. I set the phone down again, feeling the pressure build. Not confusion, not doubt, but the steady weight of being misjudged. That evening, Marin placed our calendars side by side on the table and drew a single line through the next month. We start here, she said quietly, and I knew the real confrontation was only warming up. The escalation didn't come loud. It came organized. 2 days later, Sayer showed up unannounced, standing on our porch like he owned the address as well as the bloodline. He knocked once, sharp and impatient, then checked his watch, which I found impressive considering he was early. I took my time opening the door, not out of hesitation, but because rushing is a habit I broke years ago. He stepped inside without waiting to be invited, already talking about logistics, obligations, and how everyone needed to adapt. I gestured toward the chair he used to sit in as a boy, the one with the loose leg that still wobbles if you lean back too far. He ignored it and chose my chair instead, which told me everything about the conversation he thought we were having. Marin brought coffee, set his cup down gently, and forgot the sugar, an oversight so rare it almost felt deliberate. He didn't notice. He was too busy explaining how Blythe's parents were taking the lead now, and how we could support that by being more available. I listened, nodding once or twice, then reached for my glasses and missed them, grabbing a pen instead. Sayer smirked, just for a second, mistaking a small, clumsy moment for a crack in the wall. I slid the pen into my pocket and met his eyes. You've confused availability with obligation, I said calmly. They look similar if you've never been on the other side. He laughed, short and dismissive, and said I was being dramatic. That was the moment something shifted, when he chose mockery over respect. I stood, not abruptly, but with enough certainty that the room seemed to adjust around me. This house, I added, voice steady, has rules. One of them is that no one assigns our time. As he left, Sayer muttered that we were making things difficult for no reason. I closed the door behind him and realized he'd never once asked why, and that omission would cost him more than he knew. Humiliation has a polite voice when it wants to travel far. It arrived as a group message from Blythe, sent to the entire family thread, thanking her parents for stepping up and adding that Marin and I were taking a well-earned back seat. I reread it once, then again, noticing how gratitude can be sharpened into a blade with just the right smile. Marin glanced over my shoulder and gave a soft snort, quiet, controlled, almost affectionate toward the audacity of it. Well earned, she said, folding the newspaper with surgical precision. I didn't realize we'd applied. I tried to reply, typed 3 words, then erased them when autocorrect turned measured into miserable, a reminder that even machines rush to the wrong conclusions. Instead, I put the phone down and watered the plant by the window, which promptly leaked onto my shoe because I'd overestimated its thirst. Even the fern thinks they've taken too much, I muttered, and Marin smiled without looking up. By evening, the thread filled with thumbs up and heart emojis from relatives who hadn't asked a single question. Public demotion is efficient like that. It saves time by skipping context. Sayer followed up privately, saying we shouldn't take it personally, and that this was just how families reorganize. I considered the word reorganize and how it's often used by people who move others around while staying put. We sat at the table with our calendars open, and for the first time I noticed how empty space can feel like pressure. This is intentional, Marin said, not angry, not wounded, certain. I nodded, because certainty is heavier than offense and far more useful. That night, I placed the phone in a drawer and closed it, a small gesture that felt larger than it looked. The next morning, a message came from an unfamiliar number claiming to be helping coordinate family priorities. I stared at it, amused, and wondered who'd volunteered to manage what they didn't own. The unfamiliar number belonged to Lenora, though she didn't say that at first. She introduced herself as someone just helping things run smoothly, which is usually what people say when they intend to take the wheel. She proposed a rotating holiday plan that placed us conveniently out of sight, explained with the patience reserved for children and interns. I listened, nodding even though she couldn't see it, pacing the hallway until I clipped my elbow on the corner table, my own fault for forgetting I'd moved it last spring. I apologized out loud to no one, then returned to the call and thanked her for the thought. There was a pause, the kind that expects gratitude to bloom into obedience. "We won't be participating," I said evenly, and felt the line tighten on the other end. She reminded me, politely, that Sayer agreed this was best for everyone, as if consensus had been reached in a room we'd never entered. I told her consensus without presence is just choreography, and she didn't like the word. She asked if we were feeling excluded, which was almost funny. Exclusion requires desire, and mine had already left the building. I set the phone down to adjust my glasses, put them on upside down, corrected it, and decided the day was testing my patience on purpose. When I returned, she was still talking, listing benefits like coupons that expired before you read the fine print. I ended the call gently, wished her well, and stood there for a moment, feeling something crack, not my resolve, but the last expectation that restraint would be respected. Marin met me in the doorway and read my face without asking. "They're organizing us out," she said. "Yes," I replied, surprising myself with a calm laugh. "And they think we won't notice." That evening, Sayer sent a message saying we were being unreasonable and that consequences might follow. I folded the note I'd been holding, slid it into my pocket, and understood exactly what kind of consequences we were about to choose. The threat sat between the lines of Sayer's message, polite enough to deny, sharp enough to feel. I reread it once, then set the phone face down, because some words lose their power when you refuse to look at them. Marin and I took a walk that evening, not to cool off, but to think in motion. Stillness is overrated when decisions need air. I tried to zip my jacket and caught the lining instead, wrestled with it for a moment, then laughed quietly at myself. "Even the zipper resists pressure," Marin said, and I appreciated the metaphor more than the joke. We talked about boundaries the way people talk about fences, where they start, where they end, and who gets a gate. Back home, I opened the drawer where I keep old documents and pulled out the one Sayer had forgotten existed. It wasn't dramatic, just thorough, the kind of paper that waits years for its moment and never complains. I sat at the desk and signed my name carefully, paused, then signed Marin's where she'd already told me to. The pen skipped once, a tiny blot on the page, and I shook it gently like a stubborn thought. There was no anger in me, only clarity, the clean kind that arrives when illusions finally give up. I remembered Sayer as a boy counting on his fingers, always rushing the answer, convinced speed meant certainty. Now he was rushing again, mistaking momentum for authority. I placed the document in an envelope, sealed it, and labeled it neatly, as if preparing a gift. Marin stood behind me, rested a hand on my shoulder, and said nothing. Silence can be an endorsement. The next morning, before sunrise, I scheduled an appointment that would make our absence official. By the time they noticed, the ground they'd been standing on would already be gone.
I knew the moment he scheduled that appointment, though he didn't tell me until later. There's a particular stillness that settles in him when a decision has already been made, and I've learned not to interrupt it. That morning, I watched Sayer's name appear on my phone again, 3 calls in a row, each one louder than the last without making a sound. I let the kettle boil too long and filled the kitchen with steam, then laughed softly at myself. Even water gets impatient when it thinks it's in charge. When I finally answered, Sayer spoke quickly, as if speed could outrun consequence. He asked why we were being distant, why we were making things hard, why we couldn't just fall in line like before. I told him we weren't distant. We were simply no longer convenient. There was a pause, and in that pause I heard the first crack in his confidence. He said Blythe felt hurt, and I wondered when adults began using their spouses as shields instead of partners. I reminded him, calmly, that priorities are choices and choices reorganize more than calendars. He tried to joke his way out, said I was being dramatic, and I smiled because I've heard that line from men who are about to lose leverage. I reached for my glasses, missed them, and found them already on my head, proof that even clarity can come with small blind spots. Before he could redirect the conversation, I ended the call politely, leaving him mid-sentence for the first time in his life. I sat at the table afterward, hands folded, feeling something steady rise where worry used to live. They thought silence meant surrender. They forgot I was raised to treat quiet as preparation. That afternoon, a message arrived from Blythe asking to clear the air over dinner. I agreed, already knowing this wouldn't be a conversation. It would be a reckoning. The dinner invitation was framed like a peace offering, which told me exactly how little peace was intended. Blythe chose a restaurant halfway between our houses, neutral ground for people who believe fairness is measured in mileage. I arrived with my husband 5 minutes early, not to claim territory, but to watch who entered and how. He adjusted his coat, missed the sleeve once, then fixed it without comment. Small proofs that control doesn't require perfection. Blythe and Sayre arrived together, but not in step. She walked half a pace ahead, already rehearsing the narrative. They spoke about traffic, about the menu, about nothing at all, circling the truth like it might bite. When the server asked if we were celebrating something, Blythe smiled too quickly and said, "Family." I waited until the water was poured, until the glasses stopped clinking, until silence had a spine. "You told people we were stepping back," I said evenly. "That wasn't a misunderstanding." Sayre tried to soften it, said it was about balance, about fairness, about evolving dynamics, words that travel well and mean little. I listened, nodding once, then twice, letting him finish because endings matter. "Balance," I replied, "isn't achieved by pushing someone off the scale." Blythe's fork paused midair, and for a moment she looked genuinely surprised, as if she'd expected apology, not accuracy. I reached for my napkin and dropped it, bent to retrieve it, and smiled to myself. Gravity still works, even when people pretend it doesn't. They spoke again, overlapping now, explaining intentions instead of actions, and I realized this wasn't about inclusion at all. It was about control wearing a polite coat and hoping no one checked the scenes. When the check arrived, Sayre reached for it out of habit, then hesitated when my husband calmly placed his card on the tray. That small pause told me everything. They were beginning to notice the ground shift beneath them. The shift became visible the next morning, the way fog lifts without asking permission. Sayre called early again, but this time his voice had weight to it, measured, cautious, as if he'd discovered numbers could run out. He mentioned paperwork, asked questions that pretended to be casual, and I could hear him circling something he didn't want to name. I told him we were reviewing our affairs, which is true and also wonderfully vague. There was a pause long enough for him to breathe wrong, and I imagined him pacing, bumping into furniture he'd memorized years ago. He laughed once, too loudly, and said we didn't need to make everything so formal. I reminded him that formality only scares people who've benefited from informality. While we spoke, my husband tried to fix the toaster, pressed the wrong lever, and launched a piece of bread like a small, startled bird. We both watched it land, unharmed, and he said, "Still works," which felt like commentary on more than breakfast. Sayre asked if this had something to do with money, a question that arrived late and left early. I didn't answer it directly. Answers are more effective when they arrive after curiosity has matured into worry. Instead, I told him we were stepping into a quieter phase, and that quiet requires boundaries. He grew defensive, said Blythe felt judged, and I wondered when accountability started wearing feelings as armor. I ended the call politely, wished him a productive day, and sat still long enough to feel the air settle. They were sensing the turn now, not because we'd raised our voices, but because we hadn't. That afternoon, Blythe sent a message asking if we'd changed something important, without telling them. I read it twice, then once more, and decided it was finally time they learned the difference between access and entitlement. They asked to come over that evening, which told me fear had finally found its voice. I agreed without hesitation, because confrontation is easiest when you're standing on your own floor. Blythe arrived first, scanning the house like she expected furniture to have opinions. Sayre followed, overly polite, complimenting things he'd never noticed before, including a lamp that hasn't worked since last winter. My husband offered coffee and managed to pour it everywhere except the cup, then wiped the counter slowly. Unbothered, pressure makes people reveal themselves, not us. They sat too straight, hands folded, waiting for reassurance that didn't come. Sayre cleared his throat and asked, carefully, if we'd updated any documents. I didn't answer right away. Silence is most effective when it forces people to finish their own thoughts. Blythe jumped in, saying this wasn't about control, that families evolve, that everyone needs to feel secure. I nodded once and said, security doesn't come from rearranging other people's lives. Her face tightened, not in anger, but in calculation. She was doing the math and coming up short. Sayre asked if they should be worried, and I smiled because worry is the first honest emotion he'd offered in weeks. We've done nothing reckless, I said. We've done something precise. My husband adjusted his chair, which squeaked louder than intended, and I almost laughed at how even furniture can announce discomfort. They exchanged a look that finally matched ours from that Christmas dinner, quiet, shared, and heavy with consequence. As they left, Blythe asked one last question, barely above a whisper. Are we still included? I closed the door gently and knew the answer would change everything they thought they owned. The question Blythe asked followed me into the kitchen like a draft you can't quite shut out. Are we still included? Isn't a plea, it's an audit. I poured myself tea, missed the cup slightly, and corrected without comment. Accuracy returns when you slow down. Inclusion, I thought, is not something you demand after you've reassigned the seating chart. The next day, the pressure shifted shape and arrived as urgency. Sayre called to say there was a time-sensitive issue with the kids' school paperwork, something only we could fix quickly. I listened, then asked him to send it in writing because emergencies dislike daylight. He sighed, long and theatrical, and said we were making things harder than necessary. Necessary for whom? I asked, gently enough to make him answer himself. My husband tried to open a stubborn jar beside me, tapped it once on the counter like he was knocking on sense, and it popped open immediately. Timing, he said, pleased, and I filed the moment away. Solutions often wait for respect. Sayre pivoted, said they were overwhelmed, said Blythe's parents were busy, said family needed to step up. I reminded him that stepping up is voluntary, not scheduled by committee. There was a silence thick enough to lean on, and then he asked the real question, whether we'd changed something that couldn't be undone. I told him some changes are quiet on purpose, because noise invites interference. By evening, a message came from Cormac asking for a meeting to align expectations. I set the phone down and smiled. Alignment usually happens after leverage disappears. Cormac chose a Saturday morning, which told me he believed authority wakes early. He suggested a cafe near our house, neutral territory again, as if distance could dilute truth. We arrived on time. My husband nearly sat on the wrong chair, same color, different table, then corrected with a quiet grin that said mistakes don't erase intent. Cormac shook hands too firmly, the way men do when they're unsure where the line is. Lenora followed, already speaking, already framing the conversation as cooperation rather than correction. They talked about harmony, about grandchildren, about how families function best with clear leadership. I listened, stirred my coffee, tapped the spoon once too hard against the cup, and let the sound cut through the speech. You reassigned us, I said calmly, and now you're asking us to approve it. Cormac smiled tightly and said no one was trying to push us aside. They just assumed we'd understand our new role. Roles, I thought, are costumes people put on others so they don't have to change themselves. My husband leaned back, the chair creaked louder than expected, and he murmured, still sturdy, as if testing more than furniture. Lenora asked carefully whether we'd reconsidered our recent decisions, her eyes flicking to my hands instead of my face. No, I said. We finished reconsidering when we were told we didn't matter. For the first time, Cormac stopped talking altogether. They weren't angry yet. They were recalculating, realizing the numbers they'd relied on were no longer available. As we stood to leave, Lenora asked if this meant things were changing permanently. I smiled politely, already knowing the next move would force them to feel what exclusion actually costs. The permanence didn't arrive with drama. It arrived the way truth usually does, quiet, orderly, impossible to argue with once it's in place. That Monday morning, the confirmations came through one by one, neat and official, and my husband read them aloud while standing at the counter, glasses sliding down his nose until I nudged them back with one finger. "Still need these," he said mildly, and I smiled because clarity never replaces precision. By noon, Sayer called again, but this time there was no edge in his voice, only caution. He asked if we could talk, really talk, and I told him we already had. He said Blythe was upset, that her parents felt blindsided, that no one expected things to go this far. I reminded him that distance doesn't begin with paperwork. It begins with words spoken at a table full of witnesses. There was a long silence, and in it I heard something new: recognition. Not regret, not apology, but awareness, which is where responsibility usually starts if it's going to start at all. That evening, my husband tried to hang a picture we'd moved months ago, missed the nail twice, then stepped back and said, "Wall's tougher than it looks." We left it slightly crooked on purpose. Perfection has never been our goal, ownership has. Sayer sent one final message asking what this meant for holidays, for traditions, for family. I answered simply, "It means respect comes before excess." When I set the phone down, the house felt settled, not empty, and I understood something clearly. They hadn't broken us. They had only reminded us of where our ground was, and we stood on it, unmovable, together.